A swirling mist clung to the rolling fields of the Riverlands as the dawn sky warmed to pale orange. Beneath the banner of the direwolf, King Robb Stark's host sprawled across meadows and woodlines, scattered in small clusters rather than massing as a single, tempting target. Ever since word had reached them of Tywin Lannister's catastrophic defeat at Harrenhal, an event attributed to a dragon said to be larger than Balerion the Dread, Robb and his advisors had begun heeding the lessons of that horror. To bunch themselves too tightly was to invite a single pass of hellish flame. Even if the monstrous beast did not target them specifically, caution had become second nature in a realm where a dragon now soared. The Northmen's camp teemed with early morning activity. The crackle of fires where porridge simmered in kettles, the murmur of men saddling their horses, the clank of steel as patrols prepared to ride out. Low-hanging fog drifted between tents, muffling sound so that each conversation felt cloaked in hush. In the center of this loosely arranged encampment stood the king's tent, larger though unpretentious, and a ring of guards posted around it, each man wearing the gray and white colors of House Stark or the sigils of allied riverlords. Within that main tent, a second ring of men had gathered around a heavy wooden table. The great Jon Umber, broad-shouldered and bearded. Roose Bolton, pale-eyed and measured in his speech. Lord Rickard Karstark, tall and dour with grief for his slain sons always etched on his face, and several others besides. Robb Stark, young in years yet burdened with the mantle of kingship, presided with a quiet gravity. His curly auburn hair and the gray eyes he had inherited from his mother gave him a solemn look far beyond his age. Ghostly torchlight flittered over them all, casting wavering shadows on the tent's canvas walls. They were discussing supply lines and the best routes to advance deeper into Lannister-held territory. Rumor said Tywin's forces were regrouping somewhere westward, though far fewer than before, and the strategic question was whether to press the advantage. "Now is the moment to strike," Lord Karstark was saying. "The lions are wounded. Finish them before they can lick their wounds and bring up fresh men." Roose Bolton, arms folded loosely, countered in that calm, velvety voice of his. "And if the beast that destroyed Tywin's host appears again, we do not know whether it might burn us next." An uneasy hush settled. No matter how proudly the great Jon and Karstark boasted of northern valor, the stories coming out of Harrenhal were enough to rattle even the bravest hearts. An entire Lannister legion turned to cinders in minutes. Robb looked down at the tattered map. "We'll maintain smaller, mobile groups," he said. "If we strike, we do it with caution. I will not line up thousands of men for a single sweep of Dragonflame." The great Jon gave a rumbling laugh that held little humor. "Aye, small clusters might spare us a Harrenhal fate, but I'd still relish a chance to see that dragon burn the rest of the Lannisters. We'd not mourn them." A brief, hollow chuckle passed around the group, but it subsided quickly. Everyone felt the tension. Robb, pressing his palms against the table's edges, was about to speak again when a stir at the tent's entrance drew all eyes. One of the Stark guards, breathless and ashen-faced, pushed his way inside. "My lords, your grace," he said, "a man has entered the camp. He appeared by the western pickets." Robb frowned. "A messenger from which house?" The guard swallowed. He's not wearing any sigil, my lord, or at least none that I recognize." His voice quivered. "His hair is near white blonde, almost silver in the torchlight, and his eyes, they look like they could be violet." An odd hush passed around the lords. Violet eyes, silver hair, these were the marks of Valyrian blood, and thus the stuff of Targaryen legend. Bolton, noticing the guards trembling, pressed gently. "And why do you deliver this news so breathlessly?" "Because, my lord," said the guard, "this man passed through our lines as though our men weren't there. I swear, none saw him approach. A moment ago, he was at the pickets. The next moment, he stood at the center of the camp." The Grachan's thick eyebrows rose in mingled suspicion and surprise. Robb straightened, feeling a trickle of cold run along his spine. He recalled the name that had spread through the realm like a ghost story. Vexen, the one who supposedly rode the immense black dragon that outmatched even Balerion the Dread. In all the accounts, that man was described as tall and fair of hair, with the striking color of old Valyria in his eyes. "Bring him here," Robb said, exchanging tense glances with his bannermen. "My lord, he's already outside," said the guard, clearing his throat. "He's waiting for permission to enter, but he's standing in front of the tent flaps." Robb's gaze darted to Bolton, Karstark, and the Great John. Each man's face betrayed a different swirl of emotions. Curiosity, caution, anger, or all three. None of them seemed particularly eager to let a rumored dragon lord stroll into their midst, but to turn him away could be worse. Finally, Robb nodded. "Let him come in, but hold a dozen men at the ready outside. If he so much as draws steel." "I understand, your grace," the guard said, bowing before he turned and hurried back. In the hush that followed, each lord present laid a hand on his sword hilt as a matter of reflex. Their eyes roamed for possible exits, though they all knew if the man did command a dragon the size of a castle, ordinary defenses might be worthless. Still, the only mention of that beast at present was rumor. Perhaps it was roosting somewhere beyond the horizon. The tent flaps parted. A figure stepped inside, tall, lean, and dressed in dark leathers with subtle gold details. His hair was indeed so pale it verged on silver, falling loose around shoulders, though a portion was tied back. His skin was fair in the flickering torchlight, and his eyes possessed that unsettling Valyrian hue. A pale violet shot through with flecks of silver, or so it appeared in the dim. He surveyed the watchers with a face composed, betraying no fear. A ripple of wariness moved among the Northmen. Vexen, for who else could he be, did not bow nor offer any sign of fealty. He simply took 3 steps forward, slow and measured, until he stood a short distance from the large wooden table. Outside, a half-dozen guards lingered, uncertain whether to rush in or remain posted. Robb cleared his throat, trying to project the voice of a king rather than a hesitant youth. "You stand in the camp of Robb Stark, king in the north. State your name, your purpose." A faint flicker crossed Vexen's expression, neither a smile nor a scowl, but a strange neutrality. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. "You know my name," so it was confirmed. Tension pooled in the tent like stagnant water. Bolton's thin lips compressed. Karstark's eyes narrowed. The Great John glowered, as if silently daring this man to try something. Vexen's gaze shifted across the men, taking in each face as though memorizing them. Then he made a slight tilt of his head, the only gesture that might have passed for courtesy. "I have come to speak." "What about?" Robb asked. Vexen did not answer immediately. He seemed to study the arrangement of the tent. Behind Robb hung the direwolf banner. On the table lay a map scattered with small tokens representing troops, vantage points, and supply lines. The Valyrian figure's eyes flickered over it all. One might have expected him to deliver some grand threat or ultimatum, an echo of the stories that said he had marched into Harrenhal on the back of a dragon. Instead, he offered only silence, as though he weighed what to divulge. The Great John, never one for patient waiting, took a menacing step forward, scowl etched into every bristling hair of his beard. "We hear you command the black beast that burned half the Lannisters at Harrenhal." He practically spat the words. "Where is that monster now? Will it descend on our camp too?" A pause, then Vexen responded in an even tone. "If I wanted your men burned, I would not have come alone." A low rumble of acknowledgement passed through some. This, at least, was true. They had posted watchmen on every hill and field for leagues. A dragon the size rumored could not simply hide behind a tree. Yet no watchers reported a single wing beat overhead. If the beast was anywhere nearby, it made no sign. Robb drew a slow breath. "You're bold, appearing here with no escort. You must know we have no love for the Lannisters, and certainly not for uninvited guests that could threaten our host. Explain yourself." Still, the silver-haired man said nothing. His features remained placid, his posture straight, unbowed. Eventually, though, his eyes alighted on a particular spot behind Robb, a tattered old parchment pinned to the interior wall of the tent, showing some genealogical lines of House Stark. Catelyn Stark had once worked with the scribes to piece it together, so it might help them track alliances or potential claims. At length, Vexen's gaze returned to Robb. "The realm is at war," he said softly, as though reciting some distant truth. "Fire and blood run through it like two serpents entangled. But you know that. You are one of the 5 kings." "We are well aware," Robb replied, brows knitted. "But by some accounts, you make a 6th. A moment of silence followed. Around the table, the lords seemed to brace themselves for whatever came next. At last, Vexen lifted his chin slightly, turning to let his gaze encompass them all. "I do not come to speak of the Lannisters. They have felt the price of crossing me." That statement, simple, matter-of-fact, carried a menace that raised the hackles of even the great Jon. Harrenhal's devastation needed no further elaboration. Vexen continued, his tone still subdued. "Nor do I come to demand your crown, king in the north." Some surprise flickered across Robb's face, mirrored by his bannermen. If not to threaten them, then what did he want? Bolton's eyes flicked from Vexen's face to Robb, gauging the moment. Karstark seemed almost disappointed. Perhaps he had expected a confrontation, for he was still fueled by vengeance. Robb pressed, "Then state plainly why you're here." Vexen's eyes bored into him. "I came for the Song of Ice and Fire." No one answered at first. The words sounded cryptic, vaguely reminiscent of old Targaryen oracles or the ramblings of Essosi mystics. A discomfited hush spread. Outside, the morning light brightened the canvas walls of the tent, revealing dust motes swirling in the air. "The what?" the great Jon muttered, but Roose Bolton, more learned than some gave him credit for, let out a soft hum. "I have heard the phrase," he said. "Something about prophecy or illusions of prophecy, bandied around across the sea. Some claim it refers to the Targaryen legacy. Others claim it's an old story from the Age of Heroes, perhaps referencing the White Walkers and the dragons, an interplay of ice and fire." Vexen did not nod or confirm. He simply stared, the faintest trace of tension in the set of his jaw. Legends woven into prophecy, prophecy woven into fate. A line that goes back to old Valyria and beyond. Robb frowned, feeling at a loss. He was no maester, nor did he consider himself learned in ancient lore. He cared about the war at hand, about seeing justice done for his father's death, about freeing the North from Lannister oppression. This talk of prophecy and songs made him uneasy. "I don't see what that has to do with us," he said carefully. A flicker of frustration crossed Vexen's face, though it was subtle. "You are a Stark," he said. "The blood of the first men runs in your veins. Once, the Starks were integral to shaping the fate of Westeros. There is meaning in the old legends about ice and fire uniting against a greater darkness. Perhaps you do not see it now, but it will be forced upon you soon enough." One could have heard a pin drop in that hush. The Greatjon's mouth twisted, as though trying to decide whether to mock such talk or remain silent. Karstark's eyes roved over the man, uncertain. Bolton observed with that near-surgeon calm. Robb, bristling, tried to keep his voice level. "You speak in riddles, telling us of songs and legends as if we should drop everything and chase them. I have a war to fight, and the Lannisters to defeat." "Yet the Lannisters are already undone," Vexen returned softly. "They simply do not know it yet, and the war you fight will soon prove a distraction from what truly matters." Robb stiffened at the implication that his struggle to avenge his father and liberate the North was a mere sideshow. "Is that so? Then tell me plainly, why appear before me at all?" For a heartbeat, Vexen did not speak. Then his gaze swept past Robb's face, scanning the ring of men one by one as if seeking something among them. His posture shifted, tension coiling in his shoulders. At length he spoke, but not to answer Robb's question. Instead, his voice, quiet and deliberate, formed a single sentence that sent a chill rippling through the air. "Where is Jon Snow?" The hush that followed was absolute. Every northern lord froze, as though time itself had staggered to a stop. The only sound was the crackle of the torches and the rustle of the tent walls under the morning breeze. None of them had expected that name. Robb's mouth hung open for a fraction of a second. Then he found his voice, Jon Snow. He exchanged looks with Bolton, Karstark, the Great Jon. Confusion and a hint of shock flickered across their faces. He is at the wall. He took the black. Why do you ask? Vexen said nothing more. The question had been posed, but no explanation followed. He stood in silence, eyes watchful, as if measuring the effect of that name on each man present. Jon Snow, repeated Karstark, his tone baffled, even suspicious. Ned Stark's bastard son. He's in the Night's Watch, far to the north. That cannot possibly be your business. Vexen's features remained guarded. At length he exhaled. He is of more consequence than you know. Robb's hackles rose. What do you mean? You Starks do not see the threads that bind you to the destiny of Westeros, Vexen said, voice still quiet. Ice in the north, fire in the south, and a greater threat beyond the wilds. The realm is on the brink of annihilation, though each king squabbles over a chair of melted swords. You ask me why I come here, and I say, to find what must be found. Your war is petty in the face of the storm that approaches. A flicker of anger lit Robb's eyes at the word petty. He was a patient young man, but the brand of his father's death was fresh. You speak of storms and songs, but you arrived unannounced, demanding knowledge of my brother. If you mean him harm, I mean him no harm, Vexen cut in, his voice clipped. He is key to the balance, one side of a coin that must turn. What nonsense is this? The Great Jon growled, knuckles tight on his sword hilt. You come here spouting prophecy and riddles, demanding we treat you politely because you can roast an army. If you want to see Jon Snow, ride your dragon to Castle Black. The name of the dragon was not spoken, but it hovered in the air like an unvoiced threat. Everyone had heard the terrifying rumors. A black leviathan that dwarfed even the greatest of Targaryen beasts, and they all believed Vexen commanded it. Yet here he stood alone, as if content to rely on nothing more than his presence. The tension in the tent deepened until it felt as though the walls themselves might snap. Robb placed his hands on the table, leaning forward, meeting Vexen's gaze. Jon Snow is at the wall, serving the Night's Watch. If you want him, you'll find him there. That is the only answer I have. Now, tell me why this matters to you, or I'll assume you're toying with me. A faint shadow crossed Vexen's face. The wall, the place where ice is strongest. He is there for a reason. The lines of prophecy converge. A dragon alone cannot turn the tide that's coming, nor can any single king. But the songs of old speak of a union of ice and fire that will stand against the long night. Targaryen steel and Stark blood joined, perhaps. Your father glimpsed only the edge of the truth. The mention of Ned Stark made Robb's jaw tighten. Leave my father out of your riddles. You do not know him or me or Jon. I know enough, Vexen said, his voice dropping. Across the seas, knowledge stirs among those who remember the doom of Valyria, and those who studied the Targaryen line. Some of us have gleaned bits of the puzzle. You or your kin hold another part. Jon Snow is part of it as well, though he may not yet realize it. Roose Bolton interjected, mild in tone yet carrying quiet intensity. You mentioned Targaryens. Do you claim to be one of that blood? Or a cousin from Essos? I claim no lesser ties, Vexen answered, eyes flicking to Bolton. Only that I am of the ancient blood of Valyria, from a line that survived. The Targaryens were but one branch that escaped the doom. Others existed. Karstark exchanged uneasy looks with the Great Jon. This conversation had taken on an unreal quality, as though they had stepped into a fable. They had expected threats of war, or perhaps some alliance proposal. Instead, they were entangled in talk of prophecy, ancient lines, and the notion that Jon Snow, Ned Stark's bastard, was somehow crucial. Robb forced his anger into check. If you have business with Jon, you will find him at the wall. That is all I can tell you. What do you want from me? There was a beat of silence as Vexen pressed his lips together. He seemed poised between speaking more or letting the matter drop. Then, in a measured voice, he said, I want your ears, and your caution. Caution about what? Vexen looked at each man in turn. About the nights to come, when the war in the south will prove a worthless struggle if the darkness from beyond the wall creeps across the land. About the fleeting nature of swords and spears when winter's true enemy arrives. That is what the old prophecies foretell. The living will need every ally, every sword, and perhaps every dragon. And if the realm is too divided, if each king tries to claim the throne while ignoring the real war, this entire continent could perish in ice and darkness. A hush fell. Some of the northern lords shifted uneasily. Memories of old stories, told in childhood, flitted through their minds. The White Walkers, the long night, the forging of the Night's Watch to hold back unspeakable horrors. Most had believed those tales to be no more than legends. Yet something in Vexen's unwavering gaze made them wonder. Robb tried to remain firm. You speak of the undead or White Walkers. My father believed such things to be gone, if they ever truly existed. The Night's Watch has seen no real threat in centuries. Yet that does not mean the threat sleeps, said Vexen. I have heard rumors from north of the wall, small stories of dead things walking. Winter is coming, the old Stark words say. Do you truly believe there is no truth left in the old tales? A swirl of doubt pinched Robb's expression. He remembered old Nan's stories, how they used to give Bran nightmares. He remembered the day his father spoke of the Watch with grave respect, though seldom elaborating on what might lurk beyond. In these times, with the realm torn by war, it was easy to discount the unknown. But the man standing before him exuded such conviction that it caused Robb's heart to skip a beat. We have no proof, Robb finally said. But even if it were so, what do you expect? For me to abandon the war, let the Lannisters stand unchallenged, and ride to Castle Black to watch for phantoms? Vexen's jaw tightened. He glanced at Roose Bolton, who observed him with icy composure, then at the Great Jon, who looked uneasy for once, and at Karstark, whose brow furrowed with inner conflict. I expect you to remember that your war is not the only war, Vexen replied. There are different ways to fight, ways that do not require mustering all men in a single place. You can still weaken the Lannisters without ignoring the threat in the far north. And if you doubt the truth of my words, ask your sworn brothers of the Watch. Ask your bastard brother Jon. He may have witnessed more than letters can convey. Robb's gaze flickered to the side. He hadn't heard from Jon in a while. The War of the Five Kings overshadowed simpler communications. Even if I wanted to speak to him, letters might not reach him swiftly. And you, if you have the means to appear at Harrenhal and devastate Tywin, you could certainly fly beyond the wall. Why trouble yourself with me? For the first time, a trace of weariness touched Vexen's eyes. Because the realm is big and one dragon, no matter how large, cannot be in two places at once. Because forging alliances might still save countless lives. Because the North has the old blood, a memory of the true enemy from centuries ago. And because something about the line of Starks is important for the struggle to come. That includes Jon Snow. Soft murmurs rippled among the lords. The Greyjoy's scowl shifted from hostility to puzzlement. Bolton's thin smile remained, revealing nothing. Karstark exhaled through his nose. At length, Robb asked the question that weighed on them all. Then what exactly do you want from me right now? Vexen studied him a moment. To open your eyes. To speak to you of the danger that dwarfs the War of the Five Kings. And, if you have sense, to call for your brother from the wall, or at least keep watch on any news from there. Robb took a measured breath. He found himself torn. Some part of him bristled at being lectured. He had an army to command and a mission to avenge his father. But another part recognized that the realm had indeed changed since dragons returned. Perhaps other old evils might stir too. And there was something about the name Jon Snow, about how it seemed to matter to this Valyrian dragon rider, that made him uneasy with curiosity. He looked at his bannermen. None spoke, each likely waiting for him to decide. Finally, Robb said, "Suppose I agree. Suppose I vow to keep watch on the wall. Suppose I send a rider or a raven. See if Jon will come south to speak with me or at least send word of these rumored threats. Will that satisfy you?" Vexen inclined his head slightly. "For now. The war calls you, I understand. And I have my own path to follow. "And that path?" pressed Robb. "Does it include waging war on any who stand in your way?" A flicker of something, remorse, pride, or both, crossed Vexen's face. "I do what must be done. If the realm continues to enthrone false kings who put thousands to the sword, then fear of dragons may be the only way to unite them against the real enemy." "So you would proclaim yourself a king then?" the Great John rumbled. Vexen's lips pressed together. "The realm has too many kings already, but if none can see beyond their own ambition, perhaps it needs a dragon lord more than a king." Another uneasy silence. Bolton studied him, eyes hooded. Karstark's mouth twitched in distaste. Robb raised his chin. "I'll not yield my crown," he said quietly. "The North belongs to the North, and I'll not see my men or my family's cause overshadowed by prophecy. But I'm not blind to your warnings." Vexen gave a small nod, acknowledging Robb's stance. He then shifted his attention to the battered war map on the table, carved pieces indicating Lannister holdings and Stark positions across the Riverlands. "Defeat your enemies if you must, but don't let your victory blind you to the bigger threat. Winter is coming, as your house words say, and with it, a darkness that will swallow us all if we do not stand united." Robb exchanged glances with Bolton, then the Great John. He exhaled. "I'll consider your words, and if I learn aught from Jon, I'll keep it in mind." A faint tension seemed to leave Vexen's shoulders, replaced by that same measured calm. "Then I have done what I can for now." Karstark broke in with a question that had gnawed at him. "Why speak of a song of ice and fire as though it's some living thing?" Vexen's gaze shifted. "Because the Targaryens believed their line was meant to bind ice and fire. Because the ancient prophecies from Valyria spoke of a champion who would be born from that union. Because House Stark represents the old blood of the First Men and the Cold North, while Valyrian blood carries the flame of dragons. Together, they might be the only bulwark against the long night." His words hung in the air, saturating the tent with a heavy, dreamlike dread. The Great John, usually so brash, muttered under his breath. Roose Bolton said nothing, only let his pale eyes shift from Vexen to Robb. Karstark stared at the floor, as though struggling to reconcile the notion that a bastard of House Stark might be key to world-changing prophecy. Robb pressed his lips together. "If you'd said this to my father, I don't think he would have believed you, but he had a knack for hearing out what seemed impossible." Something flickered in Vexen's eyes, almost like sorrow. "Lord Eddard Stark was an honorable man. He died in the South's Game of Thrones, a game that means little against the true war. Perhaps his son will heed what he might not have believed. Perhaps not." A hush, then Robb nodded. "I'll keep it in mind, but I can't promise more than that. My men expect me to defeat the Lannisters, free the North, and avenge my father. I cannot abandon them." Vexen said nothing, but his silence felt like acceptance. He stepped back from the table, as though preparing to depart as abruptly as he came. The ring of northern lords tensed reflexively, half expecting a show of sorcery or some lethal flourish. But Vexen merely glanced around. Bolton, ever the quiet opportunist, asked, "Are we to take it on faith that your dragon won't appear above our camp?" Vexen regarded him with an unreadable expression. "I've no quarrel with House Stark. As I said before, my quarrel lies with those who destroyed the Targaryens and tarnished the realm's future. I came to you in peace. I will leave the same way." The Great John breathed a barely audible sigh of relief, though he masked it with a gruff snort. Karstark looked as though he wanted to speak again, but the moment passed in silence. Robb lifted his chin. "Then go in peace," he said. "But remember, if you or your dragon threaten my men, we'll defend ourselves as best we can." "I would expect no less," Vexen replied quietly. His eyes flickered to the tent flap, then back to Robb. "You, king in the North, you carry your father's memory. Seek the truth behind his illusions of war and behind the wall's old legends. They may become your only shield before all is done." Robb squared his shoulders. "I'll seek the truth when time permits, but war waits for no man." Vexen's lips thinned, as though in mild disappointment, but he gave no argument. With that, he turned and strode toward the tent's exit. The line of guards parted with uncertain haste, hands on swords, but none moved to stop him. The Great John watched, arms crossed, as Vexen slipped outside into the misty morning. For a long moment, no one within the tent spoke. They listened to the faint echo of footsteps diminishing among the tents. Finally, Robb exhaled, letting out a tension he had not realized he held in his shoulders. He looked at his lords. "Well," the Great John huffed, "I'll be damned. That was not at all what I expected." Karstark's jaw worked. "I half expected him to threaten us with flame, but he asked after Jon Snow." Roose Bolton laced his fingers together, the picture of cold composure. "It seems the bastard of Winterfell is of interest to more people than we realized. Or perhaps to fewer, just this one who claims to be from Valyria." "He didn't threaten to take the north," Robb said, reasserting his calm. He seemed almost concerned about a larger war. "But do we believe him?" The Great John barked a mirthless laugh. "Hard to say. He might just want to keep us from uniting with the Lannisters or something. Or he truly does care about these old prophecies." Karstark frowned, scratching at the gray stubble on his chin. He believed the legends strongly enough to stride in here without an army at his back. No mention of needing our help beyond wanting us to heed the wall. Bolton's eyes glinted. If half the rumors of Harrenhal are true, he doesn't need an army. He has a dragon that can wipe out thousands. Robb tapped a knuckle on the table. "We can't ignore that," but he gave no immediate sign of hostility. "Perhaps we do need to send a raven to Castle Black. See if Jon will respond. Let him know that there's talk of a monstrous dragon in the south, but more importantly, that forces beyond the wall might stir." Karstark's mouth twisted. "Jon can't just leave the Watch. Once you take the Black, you belong to it for life." "I know," Robb said quietly, "but maybe he can send word, or come with the Watch's permission if the danger is as real as Vexen implies." The Great John's booming voice echoed. "We have enough on our plate, Your Grace. The Lannisters, the war. Are we truly to let these ghost stories sway us?" Robb's gaze turned inward. He had grown in these months of war, seen betrayal and death, known the heartbreak of losing his father, losing Winterfell's sense of safety. Part of him wanted to dismiss Vexen's dire warnings, to focus wholly on the war. But another part recalled that the world had changed. Dragons, once extinct, now flew again. If such an impossibility was real, how many other horrors might be stirring? "I will not be deterred from finishing this war," Robb said. "We've come too far to lay down arms. But I also won't ignore possible danger to the north or to Jon. We'll send a raven." He paused, eyes drifting to the war map. "As for the rest, let Vexen go on his way. Let us be mindful that a dragon roams the skies, but until it shows hostility, we have no cause to fight it." Bolton offered the barest bow of his head. "A prudent stance, Your Grace, and if events change, we will adapt." The lords voiced their agreement, albeit with varied degrees of enthusiasm. The Great John grumbled something about never trusting a man who could slip through guards so easily, but he acceded to Robb's authority. Karstark stared at the tent flap as though pondering whether Jon Snow truly was so important. Robb turned to the guard who hovered near the entry. "We'll dispatch a message to Castle Black immediately. Summon the Maester. Let him know that we want to speak to Jon Snow about any unusual news beyond the wall." The guard nodded and vanished. In that moment, the king in the north leaned over the table, eyes scanning the tokens that indicated Lannister positions. War beckoned in the south. In the west, Tywin might be reeling, but that old lion was still dangerous. And overshadowing it all was the memory of that silver-haired man quietly entering the camp, speaking about a prophecy-laden conflict bigger than any mere mortal war. Robb tried to force his mind back to immediate matters of strategy, but a shard of unease lodged beneath his calm. A man with a dragon had asked, "Where is Jon Snow?" As though that question were the keystone to everything else. He glanced around at his bannermen. "We continue our plan," he said, We push the Lannisters' hold on the Riverlands. But from now on, we stay scattered in smaller forces, just as we planned, to avoid being roasted by a single pass of Dragonfire. If Vexen had wanted to attack us, he might have done so already, but caution costs us nothing. They concurred, exchanging firm nods. And so the council resumed its talk of roads, rivers, and supply lines, albeit with a new tension. The possibility that a monstrous dragon might appear at any moment forced them to weigh every maneuver carefully. Outside, the day brightened, chasing away the mists in the meadow. In the makeshift lanes between tents, soldiers looked up from breakfast or from checking tack on their horses, stealing glances toward the center of camp where a tall, pale-haired stranger had emerged from the king's pavilion. A hush followed him like a ripple in a pond. Men parted warily to let him pass. Some stood stiff, hands near their sword hilts, unsure of whether to bow or brandish steel. Vexen did not seem to notice their stares. He walked with purposeful calm, his boots leaving faint prints in the damp grass, gaze fixed ahead. If any had the courage to call out or question him, he gave no response. A hush spread, for the men recalled every rumor about Harrenhal's blackened ruin, about entire companies turned to ash. They recognized this man's face from descriptions. The pale hair, the eyes the color of faint amethysts. One young soldier, no older than 15, stood quaking near a supply wagon, eyes locked on the stranger. The soldier had heard tales that even looking into those violet eyes might bring a curse. He crossed himself, muttering a prayer to the old gods. But Vexen only walked on, ignoring him entirely. At the western edge of the camp, where the pickets gave way to open fields, a pair of guards from the Mormont clan hesitantly let him pass. They had crossbows half lifted, but neither fired. Fear or wisdom stilled their fingers. Vexen stepped across the boundary of the camp into the wide country beyond, his form soon fading into the golden haze of morning. No sign of the dragon followed. No sound of beating wings. The men of the Stark camp lingered, some exhaling in relief, others sharing wary glances. An intangible weight had lifted, like the passing of a silent storm that threatened lightning but never struck. Robb's war council continued for another hour. He and his lords hammered out their strategy, discussing which river lords might support them, which roads offered the best path to outmaneuver any Lannister reorganization. They talked of forging alliances with the Tullus and ensuring the Freys did not betray them. The need to continue pressing south was strong, and if Tywin could not muster a swift counterattack, momentum lay with the north. Yet a shadow lingered over every plan. In the back of Robb's mind, a flicker of Vexen's words would not fade. Where is Jon Snow? He's of more consequence than you know. More consequence. Robb felt an ache in his chest, recalling how he and Jon had parted at Winterfell, each heading toward a separate destiny. Robb to lead the north, Jon to join the Night's Watch. They had parted with half-smiles and jokes about who would grow the better beard. Such simple memories felt painfully distant now, overshadowed by war, by the execution of Ned Stark, by the sacking of Winterfell that had scattered Bran and Rickon. Had they truly parted so lightly, never suspecting that one day some Valyrian warlord would come seeking Jon, claiming the fate of the entire realm depended on him? Sounded absurd. Yet so, too, had the notion of dragons sounded absurd, until rumors from the east spoke of Daenerys Targaryen hatching 3 hatchlings, and until word from Harrenhal described a beast bigger than even Balerion. The realm no longer had the luxury of dismissing the impossible. When at last the council broke, Robb stepped out into the clear morning light. He breathed in the crisp air, glancing about the camp. Men busied themselves with the daily chores, saddling mounts, packing tents, cooking breakfast. But an undercurrent of whispers followed him. The news of the strange visitor had already begun to ripple outward. Soldiers wanted to know who he was, what he wanted. Robb motioned for one of his personal guards. "Summon Maester Vyman," he said. "We'll send that raven north to Castle Black without delay. If Jon can respond, I want to hear what's happening beyond the wall. And perhaps he might come, if there's a chance for it." The guard bowed and hurried off. Not long after, Robb stepped away from the bustle, needing a moment of quiet. He moved behind a line of supply wagons where the noise thinned out, gazing across the soft, rolling fields. In the distance, the riverlands spread in gentle slopes and scattered copses of trees, the Tully fish banners flying in the occasional distant keep or watchtower. A crow cawed overhead, flapping its dark wings. He tried to imagine Jon standing here, hearing the same warnings. How would Jon react? Probably with the same skepticism Robb felt. Disbelief at first, then maybe a flicker of curiosity. Jon had always been serious, thoughtful, perhaps even brooding at times. If there was an ancient threat rising beyond the wall, Jon would want to face it head-on. Of that, Robb was certain. Even from a young age, Jon had proven himself dedicated to duty. That was half the reason he'd chosen the Night's Watch. But if the threat is real, Robb murmured under his breath, then everything changes. Would that mean forging alliances with the same southern houses that had taken Ned's head? Would it mean abandoning the War of the Five Kings to rally together? The thought made him uneasy. The memory of Joffrey's smug face as he demanded Ned's execution flashed through Robb's mind, bringing a fresh wave of anger. He would not so easily forget or forgive. And yet, if this rumored long night approached, would that old enmity matter in the end? He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. The sky overhead remained free of monstrous shadows, at least for now. The hush of the breeze and the distant clang of steel reminded him that life went on, that they still had to march. The notion that House Stark might be central to some prophecy felt almost insulting, as if fate demanded more suffering from his already broken family. Arya was missing. Sansa was a prisoner in King's Landing. Bran and Rickon rumored to be dead, though he clung to desperate hope that they lived. Jon was on the wall, sworn to a lonely duty. And yet Vexen spoke as though the Starks were essential to staving off a cataclysm. Robb opened his eyes. The realm was in chaos, but one thing was certain. If Vexen was right, if the night truly held horrors beyond mortal comprehension, then they would soon find out, probably too soon for anyone's comfort. He turned away from the sight of the open fields, returning to the heart of the camp. A cluster of men parted to let him pass. He forced a calm expression. As king in the north, he had to project confidence, even if a swirl of doubt gnawed inside. "Your Grace." One of the men greeted him, bowing slightly. Robb nodded, acknowledging him without pausing. Within the hour, Maester Vyman arrived, hunched under his heavy gray cloak, a raven perched on his gloved wrist. Robb quickly dictated a message. "Jon, word reaches us of dire events and rumors. A man of Valyrian descent came to my camp, claiming a great threat stirs beyond the wall. He asked for you by name. If you receive this letter, send word of your well-being and any tidings of unusual occurrences. Should you be able to, I would have you come south for counsel, though I know your vows bind you. We have also learned of a massive dragon in the realm, but that is a matter for another time. Be safe, brother. Tage. Times are dark indeed. Robb Stark, King in the North." Robb spoke the words slowly, letting the maester transcribe them on crisp parchment. Vyman then rolled it, sealed it, and secured it to the raven's leg. At Robb's nod, the maester carried the bird to a makeshift perch outside the tent. With a few flutters and a soft croak, the raven took flight, winging toward the north under the pale sun. Robb watched it disappear. He had no guarantee that the message would even reach Castle Black. The journey was long and the realms were rife with war, but he had to try. If Jon or the Watch had any clue about rising threats, they needed to coordinate. After the raven's departure, the king called upon his advisors again. The final tasks of the day demanded attention. Scouts had returned with fresh intelligence about a small Lannister contingent stationed at an old castle near the Tumblestone. The men were restless to press the advantage. Robb laid out a plan to harry them, hoping to draw more of Tywin's men into open ground, though not too open, lest the rumored Black Dragon appear unbidden. That irony was not lost on him. The Lannisters, once so formidable, might now fear the same unstoppable foe that threatened everyone. Some part of him almost wished the beast would keep burning Lannister forces, but he refused to place faith in that. Vexen's goals seemed too obscure. and trusting a man who spoke in half-prophecies and demanded Jon Snow's whereabouts struck Robb as folly. And yet, one persistent memory dogged him. The cold certainty in Vexen's voice when he named the Song of Ice and Fire, or described the real war that dwarfed mortal struggles. Robb glanced at the half-rolled map, at the wooden tokens representing kings and armies. If White Walkers were truly awakening, if a monstrous winter threat loomed, then what good would any of this do in the end? Still, he couldn't simply abandon his fight. The men who looked to him for leadership, the memory of Ned Stark, the atrocities inflicted on the Riverlands, those were real and pressing. If they let the Lannisters regain strength, more innocents would die, more outrages committed. The North's future depended on winning this war. Determination steeled him. War in the South might be overshadowed by the greater darkness, but for now, it was the challenge he could meet. If Vexen believed in a prophecy, that was his business. Robb Stark, king in the North, would do his duty. If the long night came, perhaps they would all stand together then, grudgingly or not. Night fell swiftly, the campfires dotting the field like fireflies. Robb paced outside his tent for a time, gazing at the star-strewn sky. He half expected some roiling black silhouette to blot out the moon, but none appeared. Only the quiet hush of wind and distant murmurs of men. Nearby, gray wind prowled. The great direwolf's ears pricked. He sensed Robb's tension. The wolf pressed his muzzle against Robb's leg, a reassuring presence. Robb stroked behind Grey Wind's ears, recalling simpler days in Winterfell's courtyards when Jon stood beside him. "Where is Jon Snow?" Vexen had asked, like it was the single question that mattered in all the realm. If only Robb had the answer. He knew only that Jon was on the wall. But the specifics? He had no idea what tasks the Night's Watch might have given him, whether he patrolled the haunted forest or manned the icy ramparts. Did Jon sense a growing shadow, too? Did messages from Eastwatch or the Shadow Tower speak of Whites or White Walkers? Robb exhaled, letting the chill night air fill his lungs. "I'll know soon enough," he whispered, though he doubted the Raven's journey would be swift. Around midnight, he finally retreated to his tent. Sleep came in fits. He dreamed of swirling snowdrifts and shapes moving in the darkness, stark white figures with blue eyes. He dreamed of fire bursting from the sky, a black dragon roaring. He dreamed of standing on a parapet of ice, seeing Jon in the distance, beckoning him to come. The images blurred and melted, leaving him restless beneath furs. At times, the faint voice from his dream repeated Vexen's ominous words. "A dragon alone cannot turn the tide, nor can any single king." And the name that stood out above all else was Jon Snow. When he rose at dawn, he felt no more certain of the future. The camp ready to move, striking tents and repacking wagons. Scouts were already riding out. Robb oversaw these preparations, waiting for the final count of men who would march west to flush out the Lannisters near the Tumblestone. The old routine of war consumed him again, providing a strange comfort. But as they set out, with a brisk pace across meadows damp from dew, Robb found his gaze drifting to the sky more often than before. The intangible weight of living under possible dragonfire changed a man's perspective. And every time he scanned the horizon for any black shape, he found himself asking, why had Vexen singled out Jon? He confided none of this to his men. They needed unwavering leadership, not riddles. So he maintained a firm outward resolve, discussing tactics, ensuring the outriders fanned out, reminding them not to cluster too closely. The march began, a column of men in scattered platoons, horns braying occasionally to keep them aware of one another's positions. By midday, the sun grew warm, burning off any lingering haze. The great Jon rode beside Robb, clad in steel and leather, great swords strapped across his back. He gave Robb a sidelong glance. "Your Grace, if you don't mind my asking, is there something more you gleaned from that silver-haired fellow?" Robb shook his head. "No, aside from a lot of cryptic talk." The great Jon made a face. Well, cryptic talk or no, I won't soon forget Harrenhal. If a dragon can do that to the Lannisters, I'm half glad the fellow hasn't turned on us. Let's hope he keeps his word." Robb nodded absently. The Great John's simpler perspective offered some relief. Fear the dragon, yes, but keep forging ahead. That was all a soldier could do in times like these. They pressed on, the day passing in the manner of any campaign. Scouts returned with occasional sightings of Lannister outriders, or possibly bandits wearing Lannister colors. The countryside seemed half abandoned. Small folk had fled deeper into the woods, or gathered behind local lords' walls for protection. Fields lay unharvested. The crop turned brown. Streams carried a hush of sorrow. Late in the afternoon, the Great John announced that the outriders had caught a few Lannister scouts, men who spilled half-truths about Tywin's retreat. It seemed the old lion was rumored to be regrouping near a minor stronghold, though none of them could say for sure. So they marched in that direction, seeking to cut off supply lines and test any defenses. All the while, Robb's mind flicked between the immediate demands of war and the overshadowing puzzle of Vexen's warning. He found himself studying each ridge and hill, half expecting the monstrous black shape of a dragon to appear at any moment. It never did. The nights that followed were quiet, but no less tense. Fires dotted the darkness of the northern encampment. Men told hushed stories about Harrenhal, speculating whether one day they'd see that black beast in the sky. Some even boasted that a well-aimed scorpion or volley of arrows could bring it down, while others sneered that nothing of mortal make could harm a creature so immense. Robb let them talk. He gave no official stance on the matter, except to remind them that caution was wise. There was no sense in fueling panic or false confidence. The war progressed in small increments, skirmishes that gained or lost a few miles of territory. A week passed without a single sign of Vexen or his dragon. The men in Robb's army began to wonder if the rumored meeting had all been an omen that would never bear fruit. Perhaps the man had vanished back into the mists, never to be seen again. But the question of Jon Snow still loomed. Had the raven reached him? Would he reply? Robb busied himself with command, writing letters to various riverlords, planning a potential siege on a Lannister-held tower, and conferring with the Great John, Karstark, and Bolton on the best strategies. Yet an undercurrent of impatience gnawed at him. Vexen's cryptic statements had left a bruise on his thoughts, though he would not show it. Occasionally, he recalled that single moment when Vexen's eyes swept the tent and he asked, "Where is Jon Snow?" The words brimming with unspoken import. It felt like the beat of a drum from a distant battlefield, echoing across the land. Robb told himself he would do what was necessary when the time came. If winter truly brought nightmares from beyond the wall, if Jon confirmed it, then perhaps they would have to shift priorities. But for now, the realm was still locked in the War of the Five Kings, and the North's vengeance on the Lannisters was far from complete. So the days wore on, small battles flaring in the riverlands. Tywin Lannister did not show himself in large force. Renly Baratheon still marched near the Reach, and Stannis lingered on Dragonstone. The Ironborn raided far-off coasts. Everywhere, armies jockeyed for position, uncertain whether the next sunrise might bring a black silhouette overhead. In quiet moments, Robb found himself wondering about Vexen's true motives. Was he truly concerned about an otherworldly threat, or was that just a pretext to keep the northern armies from interfering with his own ambitions? Even if Vexen was sincere, what proof did he have that an ancient darkness stirred? But no matter how often Robb turned the question over, it all came back to that single puzzle. Why single out Jon? Why treat him as crucial to the so-called Song of Ice and Fire? In the old tales, a Targaryen or Valyrian heritage usually pointed south, not north. Jon Snow was a bastard of House Stark with no known link to Targaryens, unless the rumors were wilder than anyone guessed. Could there be secrets about Jon's parentage? That thought was too outlandish even to consider, or so Robb told himself. He found no answers among his lords. The Great John shrugged. Bolton offered measured shrugs of his own, with no direct insight. Karstark grumbled that perhaps the bastard was fated to kill White Walkers. But it was a half-jest, half-disturbing suggestion. Robb reminded himself not to dwell too deeply. The war demanded his focus. If word came from the Wall, he would hear it soon enough, assuming the crows flew true. That was the best he could do. Yet some nights, when the campfires burned low and the sky was a tapestry of stars, He would stare into the embers and recall Vexen's calm, near-sorrowful gaze. And he would remember that final, simple sentence, quiet yet weighted with an entire realm's unanswered questions. Where is Jon Snow? So time advanced in measured steps. Robb continued his campaign, forging deeper into the Riverlands, pushing Lannister garrisons to retreat or face small defeats. He did so with the same tactics he had used before: cunning feints, swift maneuvers, dividing his forces to prevent being caught in a single conflagration. Whenever someone asked if they feared the dragon, Robb only said they had no quarrel with it, and it seemed to have no quarrel with them. The men accepted that, and so the war continued in its bloody, grinding fashion. The memory of Vexen's visit lingered but did not consume their days. It was simply one more thread in a tapestry of chaos, a tapestry that included 5 rival kings and now possibly a 6th, plus talk of the White Walkers, plus rumors about Daenerys Targaryen across the sea, plus more mundane horrors like bandit raids and starvation among the small folk. But beneath all that noise, the question refused to die. The question repeated in Robb's thoughts like a half-remembered tune in the hush before sleep or the stillness before dawn. A question that pointed north, beyond the civilized world, where Jon Snow stood watch on the wall. Where is Jon Snow? And why did a dragon lord care so very much about him? In that quiet, uncertain interlude, there was no answer. Only the fading echo of a silver-haired figure who appeared in the Stark camp unannounced, weaving talk of prophecy and ice and fire. A figure who left a single question suspended like a blade over the world, waiting to fall. So life went on in Robb Stark's camp, in the midst of war's daily demands. The lines of conflict shifted. The small triumphs and losses continued. The northern men woke each day expecting ordinary war. Raids, forced marches, scrapes with Lannister men. They kept their vigilance for any sign of monstrous black wings overhead. None came. Still, the realm had changed, and each soldier felt it in their bones. Some nights, the wind carried faint howls from distant wolves. Men would glance skyward, imagining they heard another sound hidden in the gloom, the roar of a dragon or something else. On such nights, Robb stared at the stars and murmured under his breath, "Jon, I hope you're safe. If there's truth in what he says, then God's help us all." For the moment, that was all the North could do. Press forward in a war of crowns, while an older and deeper melody thrummed in the background. A melody that might one day become a roar, a song of ice and fire that would force them all to face the secrets Vexen had hinted at. The war moved on day by day. Ravens flew, men fought, villages burned, and the swirl of alliances and betrayals continued. Yet the name Jon Snow, once a footnote in the story of House Stark, now carried an unseen weight that no one in Robb's camp could fully grasp. Perhaps the answer lay at the wall. Perhaps in some hidden chamber of truth that Ned Stark, in his grave, could not reveal. But for now, Robb prepared for the next battle, his wolf prowling at his side, his banner streaming overhead. He was a king at war, guided by duty, vengeance, and the love of his people. If a time came when the White Walkers emerged as Vexen prophesied, if the dragon soared overhead, and if the name Jon Snow truly held the key, Robb would meet that challenge as best he could. Until then, the rhythms of war and winter marched on in tandem, unstoppable forces that left no corner of Westeros untouched. And somewhere, beyond the ring of tents, beyond the fields and rivers, that tall, silver-haired figure strode the realm in silence, bearing the knowledge of an ancient prophecy. Vexen had asked his single question. The realm might soon find that the search for Jon Snow was, in fact, the search for the Song of Ice and Fire itself. And for the time being, no mortal power could claim to know the end of that song, or who would live to hear its final verse. Robb Stark had never felt so keenly the chill wind blowing down from the far north as he did on the night he announced his decision. It was a decision he had mulled for days, pacing by lamplight in his tent, debating the merits and demerits of so bold a move. A hush now blanketed the heart of his encampment as his bannermen gathered at the center. A ring of them, some still smelling of horse and sweat after a long day's march, others fresh from the supply lines. Torches sputtered in the dusk, illuminating tense faces. Overhead, a shroud of thin clouds drifted across a pallid moon, offering only the most meager light. The War of the Five Kings raged on in the Riverlands and beyond, but Robb Stark, king in the north to his loyal men, had found his ambitions diverted by a new and disquieting reality. Word of a monstrous dragon, bigger than even Balerion the Black Dread, had shaken the realm, and the man who commanded that dragon, Vexen, had appeared in Robb's camp not long ago. That singular meeting had changed the shape of Robb's thoughts. His father's death still cried out for vengeance, and yet Vexen's warnings about a darker threat beyond the wall, combined with cryptic references to the Song of Ice and Fire, had made Robb realize that the North, his North, might be in mortal peril from something far worse than the Lannisters. But perhaps the final, most unsettling impetus for Robb's new course of action had been Vexen's pointed question, "Where is Jon Snow?" The question had gnawed at Robb's mind like a rat in the night, and though Vexen had said little more than that Jon was crucial, it had been enough to rattle Robb's resolve. Jon was family, bastard or not, half-brother or not, he was Ned Stark's son. If there was some looming threat in the far north that might imperil both Jon and the entire realm, Robb would not stand idle. And so he resolved on a measure that had left even his staunchest supporters uneasy, sending 200 men to Castle Black with orders to bring Jon south by any means necessary. The vow of the Night's Watch was for life, yes, but these were extraordinary times. If Vexen was right, if the dead themselves stirred beyond the wall, then the realm's leadership had to know the truth straight from Jon Snow's own lips. If no one would come south willingly, Robb would see it done by force. With luck, it would not come to that. But in war, luck was a thin garment against the cold winds of necessity. Now, in the circle of torches, Robb lifted his chin and spoke to his lords. "In 2 days, I'll dispatch 200 men to Castle Black. You've heard me speak of it before, and many of you have expressed doubts. But I've weighed the costs. Jon Snow is my brother by blood, sworn to the Night's Watch or not, and if he possesses knowledge that can save this realm from catastrophe, I'll have it. My father would never have forgiven me for ignoring the North's truest dangers." A murmur rippled through the gathered lords. Some nodded in acceptance, great Jon Umber chief among them, for all his bluster, still fiercely loyal to the Starks. Others looked uneasy. Roose Bolton, ever a quiet observer, tilted his head thoughtfully, while Rickard Karstark pursed his lips as though anxious about dividing their strength at a time they might need every sword against the Lannisters. But none openly objected. King Robb's will would be done. "I've chosen 200, Robb said, voice clear. "A mix of sworn swords from houses Umber, Karstark, Mormont, and others. Men I trust to do as I command without losing their heads. They ride under a Stark banner, but they'll do so quietly. No need to draw half the realm's attention to the fact that the king in the north is meddling with the wall. The Night's Watch might not take kindly to having one of their own taken away," said Karstark gravely. "The Watch is neutral in these wars." "I'm aware," Robb replied, "but the wall is mine to protect as well. The Night's Watch draws its recruits from across the 7 kingdoms, but historically, it has always been the North's duty to see them provisioned and safe. I do this for the realm's sake. If the Watch forbids them from passing, then my men have orders to bypass that obstacle. They won't slay Black Brothers, but they will bring Jon out, one way or another." Great Jon Umber let out a thunderous laugh. "I'd like to see those crows try to stand against a band of Northmen. 200 hardy swords, all to fetch one bastard boy. Must be an important lad indeed." Robb's eyes flicked sideways, remembering Vexen's solemn tone. Important beyond measure, if the rumors were true. Aloud, he only said, "You've all heard enough from me about the dire possibilities. We'll see what Jon knows. If he knows nothing, we can return him with apologies. But if the threat is real, we must be prepared." The lords acquiesced, some more eagerly than others. Robb knew it was a gamble, but he felt that his father, who had always prized caution and honor, would nevertheless want the truth from the wall. And if that truth was indeed the stirring of White Walkers, an enemy that could overshadow even the monstrous dragon in the south, the 7 helped them all. Thus decided, the council began to disperse. Karstark headed off with his men to finalize the list of volunteers. Bolton followed in pensive silence, and the Great John lingered only long enough to clap Robb heartily on the back and declare, "We'll see this done, lad, and done well," before lumbering away. Robb let out a breath. He had half expected more resistance. 200 men was not an insignificant portion of his forces, but apparently their faith in him, or fear of the threat implied, carried the moment. He stood quietly a while, allowing the sounds of the camp to wash over him. The braying of horses, the crackle of fire, the low hum of men's voices. Shadows danced on the grass. Some men drank or gambled under makeshift canopies, while others stood watch under the stars. War had taught them all to remain vigilant, especially with rumors that Tywin Lannister's battered forces might resurface in cunning ambushes. But the greatest vigilance, Robb knew, might soon be needed in a different direction. He was about to retreat to his tent when Vexen emerged from the darkness, as if conjured by thought alone. The tall, silver-haired figure cut a striking shape by torchlight. Hair near white, eyes of a faint violet hue, wearing black leathers and cloak. This time, the camp's men did not panic at his arrival. Word had spread that he had come peacefully before, but that did not mean they were easy in his presence. A hush followed him, and those who lacked pressing business found somewhere else to be. More than once, Robb caught them staring at Vexen's back, as though they expected a giant winged shadow to appear behind him at any moment. Vexen approached Robb with measured footsteps. "You've decided," he said in a low voice that carried more curiosity than question. "I have," Robb replied. 200 men to fetch Jon from Castle Black. It's not a small risk, but I can't ignore your warnings." A flicker of something, approval perhaps, glided over Vexen's face. He must be brought south. The realm stands on the brink of multiple disasters, and certain bloodlines may be essential to forging unity. Robb studied the man in the flickering light. "You speak always of forging unity, yet you also talk of dethroning kings and punishing those who tarnished the realm's future." His voice held a note of challenge. "A moment ago, you were telling me the real war was up north. Now you'd have us shift attention south." Vexen's posture remained straight, his expression inscrutable. "The north must be warned and defended, but the rest of Westeros is too fractured. Your father died because of House Lannister's greed, their cunning, and the weakness of the Iron Throne. I have no love for that Iron Throne, but the realm needs stability. Better a unified kingdom that can face the threat from beyond the wall than half a dozen kings squabbling over spoils." Robb's temper flared a little, remembering Joffrey's smug grin and Cersei's manipulations. "I won't argue that the Lannisters are unfit to rule, but how exactly do you propose to unify us when there are so many claimants? Stannis, Renly, Joffrey, even Balon Greyjoy, they all want crowns." A faint ghost of a smile tugged at Vexen's lips. "Not all are equally deserving of them, and Joffrey, well, the bastard in every sense of the word." He paused, and his eyes gained a glittering intensity. "It's about time I dethroned that inbred boy and his mother." The statement, uttered so casually, sent a jolt through Robb. Men in the distance paused in their chores, as if they had overheard. Perhaps they only sensed the tension. Robb tried to keep his voice down. "You mean to dethrone them yourself?" Vexen nodded once. "Cersei Lannister and her product of incest have sat on the Iron Throne long enough. Even ignoring their cruelty, their legitimacy is a sham. Every moment they remain in power is one in which Westeros further divides. The Lannisters cling to gold and fear, but they cannot unify the realm against the darkness. They're more likely to do the others' work for them." Robb's lips twisted. "I won't shed tears if you rid us of Joffrey, but is that not a distraction from the threat you say you came here to warn us about? Not if it eliminates the greatest cause of discord among the lords," Vexen said. "You need the entire realm's cooperation to hold back what's coming from the north. Joffrey and Cersei will never allow that unity. Their selfishness and tyranny only foster more rebellion. Better to cut that rot from the tree." At that moment, a booming voice cut through the hush like a hammer through glass. Great John Umber approached at speed, a skin of ale in his hand. "Ha! "You speak true, Vexen," he roared, half-sloshed. "Why not simply hop on your damned monster and burn the red keep to the ground? That'd settle the question quick enough. Wouldn't it?" The flame of a nearby torch danced on Gretchen's ruddy face, accentuating his broad grin. His suggestion was so brash, so typically Umber-like, that even Robb found himself momentarily tongue-tied. Vexen, though, regarded the big man with a level stare. He did not laugh, but neither did he bristle. "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Vexen said coolly. A ripple of shock passed through the men present. A few knights and guards, hearing the words, exchanged alarmed looks. One or two of them fingered their sword hilts, as though unsure whether to question or celebrate such a plan. Robb himself blinked, thinking surely he had misheard. The Great John bellowed with sudden laughter, but even that was tinged with surprise. "You're jesting," he said after a moment. "A single pass of flame to turn the red keep into cinders? That's not something I'd mind seeing. But, by the gods, are you serious?" Vexen's tone held no mirth. "Deadly serious. Then you plan on murdering half of King's Landing along with Joffrey?" Robb asked sharply. "You realize tens of thousands of small folk live in that city, yes? You'd consign them to a fiery death along with their so-called king." Vexen's eyes narrowed. "I am not the Mad King, nor do I desire mass slaughter. I have ways of keeping the city's heart safe if the city's masters have the sense to flee. But the seat of power must be broken for a new foundation to rise. Burning the Red Keep is symbolic. It tears down the false monarchy." Before Robb could voice another protest, someone else arrived. Catelyn Stark, emerging from the gloom, her cloak wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She had overheard enough to gather the gist. When Catelyn spoke, the men closest to her stepped aside in deference. Few questioned the mother of the king in the north, widow of Ned Stark, a figure of both sorrow and fierce maternal pride. "Robb," Catelyn said firmly, her voice carrying the tone she once used to reign in her sons when they were boys. "You cannot allow this to happen." Robb turned to face her, startled by how swiftly she had come. "Mother, But Catelyn brushed past him, leveling her gaze at Vexen. Despite the difference in height and the rumors swirling about him, she showed no fear. Her grief-hardened eyes could pierce steel. "We've lost enough innocence. If you fly that beast to King's Landing, the flames will not distinguish between the guilty and the helpless. How many children will be burned alive? How many families incinerated? Have you no mercy?" A flicker of an emotion, regret possibly, passed over Vexen's features. "Lady Stark, I do not seek to kill small folk, but the city must see that the usurpers who taint the realm's stability are undone. If Cersei and Joffrey have any sense, they'll flee before my flames claim them. The problem is, Cersei rarely shows sense. She'll cling to power until the last moment, then find another way," Catelyn insisted, the fervor in her voice betraying both fear and moral conviction. "Killing thousands to dethrone two is monstrous. My lord husband died at the hands of Joffrey. Yes, but Ned would never have wanted innocent blood spilled for vengeance. He fought for justice, not chaos." Vexen parted his lips to respond, but then paused, as though choosing his words. "This is not about vengeance, my lady. It's about removing a poison that keeps the realm divided. We need a united Westeros to face what's coming. The Lannister hold on the throne is the single biggest barrier to that unity." Catelyn shook her head in dismay, as though dealing with a wayward child. "Burning the Red Keep might well unite the realm, in horror at your brutality. You'd make yourself the very tyrant you claim to hate. Fire and blood are not the only ways to break an enemy." Silence followed. The Great John was still half grinning, uncertain whether to jump into the fray. Robb laid a hand on his mother's shoulder. "We might be able to dethrone Joffrey without incinerating King's Landing," he said quietly to Vexen. "There are other claimants. If you unite the Baratheon brothers, as you said, perhaps the city can be taken with minimal slaughter." Vexen's gaze flicked between them. Then he offered the barest nod. "That is indeed my next intention, to unite the Baratheon brothers. Renly gathers men in the Reach, and Stannis broods on Dragonstone. One of them might claim the throne legitimately as King Robert's rightful heir, at least more rightful than Joffrey, who is no Baratheon at all. Lord Umber, who had until now listened with a thick-lipped scowl, piped up, "Then what's the fuss with the Dragonfire? If you want them dethroned, get the other kings to join you and starve out King's Landing." Vexen lifted a pale eyebrow. "If only it were so easy. The realm is in chaos. Rivalries, old feuds, and mistrust hamper each side. Stannis and Renly are at each other's throats, unwilling to compromise. If I can force them to see reason, or if you, King Robb, can help broker it, then perhaps we can avoid turning the Red Keep into slag." Robb exhaled. "I would love nothing more than to see Joffrey undone. He murdered my father, violated every law of honor. But my mother is right. We have to consider the small folk. They are as much the realm as lords and ladies. I cannot in good conscience condone slaughter." Vexen considered him, eyes faintly glowing in the torchlight. Then he turned to Catelyn. "Lady Stark, I ask you to trust that I am not the second coming of Ares the Mad. I do not relish the thought of killing thousands. But I also cannot let the Lannisters remain while the living realm tears itself apart." Catelyn met his gaze without wavering. "You speak of necessity, yet I hear only destruction. No plan to evacuate the city or ensure the safety of the people. If you truly want to unify Westeros, you must behave like a ruler who values the lives of those beneath him." "I am no king," Vexen replied almost curtly, "but I understand your concern. Very well." He tilted his head a fraction as if relenting. "We will, for now, attempt to unify the Baratheon brothers before I perform such a task. If that fails, I may have to ensure the dethronement by more direct means." A new tension spread among the onlookers. Catelyn drew a slow breath, as though uncertain whether to press further. Robb's expression was equally uneasy. Some part of him suspected that if Stannis and Renly refused to align, Vexen would indeed carry out his threat, and likely kill an untold number of innocents in the process. Yet at least now there was time, a window in which to attempt a more measured approach. "Stannis has the superior legal claim," Robb said, "but Renly had the larger host, the support of the Tyrells. Until rumors of his death under suspicious circumstances, or so I heard. Actually, wait. Last I heard, Renly was indeed struck down. Some said it was sorcery, others said it was an assassin. Now the Tyrells have allied with the Lannisters. If that's so, then our chance to unify the Baratheons might be gone." Vexen's eyes flashed. "Rumors swirl. I've heard conflicting tales. Some say Renly died. Others say he survived an assassination attempt. In times of war, truth is often the first casualty. We must ascertain the facts. If Renly lives, he could unify the Reach with Storm's End. If not, Stannis remains the only legitimate Baratheon contender, but he's no friend to half the realm. This is precisely why I have come to you. You hold men loyal to the north and now a portion of the Riverlands. You are a third power. Together, we might influence events." Catelyn looked from Vexen to her son, her expression a swirl of regret and urgency. "Robb, your father never wanted the throne. He wanted justice for the realm. If we're to step into the southern labyrinth of kings and claims, we must tread carefully. We came south to fight for Ned's memory, not to become embroiled in every new twist of the War of the Five Kings." Robb placed a reassuring hand over hers. "Mother, I haven't forgotten, but I also can't ignore the bigger threat Vexen spoke of. The White Walkers or whatever stirs beyond the wall. We need unity to face that. If there's one thing Father always taught me, it's that the North stands first, but when the entire realm is threatened, we must set aside smaller grievances. If dethroning Joffrey and removing Cersei is the price for forging unity, so be it." Lord Umber, who had quieted down after his initial outburst, now spat on the ground. "Treason, betrayal, Lannisters. Fuck them all. I'd gladly see that boy King flayed and his mother strung up. But, Your Grace, how do you plan to manage the risk that we become pawns of this Valyrian? He commands a dragon as big as a castle, or so they say. He might roast us next if we fail him. Vexen did not bristle at the direct mention. Instead, he answered in a calm, steely voice, "I gave no oath to burn the North. I do not threaten House Stark. My war is with the false kings that perpetuate the realm's fragmentation. And yes, I include the Iron Throne in that condemnation." "Then you'll leave the North to its independence?" Robb asked, a note of skepticism in his voice. "If it stands against the real threat, I see no reason to subdue it," Vexen replied. "I am not Aegon the Conqueror. I'm not here to gather every corner under one banner by force. But I would see the realm prepared as a single shield against the nightmares beyond the wall. And for that, we need a stable seat of power in King's Landing or none at all." Robb nodded slowly, his shoulders easing a fraction. "If that's the truth, then we may have common cause. We just need to approach this carefully." Then he turned to his mother again. "You see, we might spare thousands by forging alliances first, and only resort to the dragon's fire if we must." Catelyn's gaze flicked back to Vexen. She said nothing for a moment, measuring him. "Your claim to be different from the Targaryens of old remains to be tested. My children have seen enough horrors. If you bring more, I will not forgive you." "I understand," Vexen answered. "Lady Stark, I hold no illusion that you trust me fully, but your son's men are heading north to retrieve Jon Snow. That's a wise step. The boy's knowledge, and possibly his presence, will matter in the conflicts to come. So I shall do my part. Contact the Baratheons, see if alliances can be forged. Then, if Joffrey and Cersei remain intransigent and refuse to cede, I will do what I must." The finality in his voice left no room for argument, though it was softened by the nod of concession he had given earlier. Catelyn exhaled, looking to Robb. He nodded, trying to signal reassurance. For better or worse, he was in league with a man who commanded unstoppable power. If they could harness that power without letting it run amok, perhaps the realm could be saved from both Lannister tyranny and the Northern nightmares. "Well then," said Robb, stepping back. He looked around to see that a small crowd of soldiers had gathered at a distance, listening. "We have our tasks. Vexen, you intend to travel soon?" "I do," the silver-haired man replied. "Time is not a luxury we possess." Catelyn stepped forward, as though a sudden thought had seized her. "If you have the means to travel swiftly by Dragonback, will you see reason in avoiding wanton destruction among the small folk, if at all possible?" She was repeating her earlier argument, but more quietly, as though she sought personal assurance. Vexen nodded. "I told you, I am not my ancestors who reveled in fear alone. I want the realm to stand, not to see it drowned in blood." Relief flickered over Catelyn's face, though it was tempered with the knowledge that intentions often go astray in war. "Then go, do what you must. But remember my words. Sometimes clemency reaps more loyalty than terror." Vexen did not argue. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned to Robb. "One final matter. These 200 men you send to the wall, be sure they're led by someone you trust implicitly. The Night's Watch does not yield easily, and if your men cause undue strife, it may hamper Jon's willingness to come." Robb dipped his head. "Lord Bolton suggested his bastard, Ramsay Snow, but I refused. That one is rumored to be cruel. I'll pick a more even-tempered commander. I want Jon safe, not dragged south in chains. 200 men is force enough to make the Watch think twice, but it's not to be a massacre." Vexen's lips curved in a thin smile. "Wise. Then I wish them luck. I sense that time grows short. Forces stir in the icy dark." The great Jon, though mostly silent now, grunted in half-drunken affirmation. "We'll handle it, Dragonlord. You just see to that scum on the Iron Throne." Vexen inclined his head. "Then we have an accord." With that, he turned and strode away into the deeper darkness, his cloak trailing behind him. Men stepped aside, silent, as though parting before an apparition. Torches cast his long shadow upon the ground. Robb, Catelyn, and Great Jon Umber stood watching him for a few beats. Then the Great Jon gave a scratch of his beard. "Better him than me if it means toppling that viper's nest. Though I won't deny I'd love to watch the Red Keep burn, If only the small folk could get out first. Catelyn shot him a look, but it lacked true admonishment. Robb, come. We should speak more of these next steps. If you are truly to try uniting the Baratheons, Stannis or Renly, how do we even begin? Robb sighed, fatigue settling on his face. We'll need to send emissaries, or perhaps go ourselves. But one step at a time. First, we handle the mission to the Wall. Then we see how the war shifts. Maybe the Lannisters have gleaned that a dragon might come for them. That could change everything. The Great John took a swig from his ale skin. I'll gather the men in the morning to see your orders done. A few of my best will ride north. Enough to open the Watch's gates if they balk. Catelyn rested a hand on Robb's arm. We'd best talk in private. This alliance with Vexen, if we can call it that, might cost you the faith of other lords. They might see it as dancing with a devil. You must keep the North united behind you, Robb. He studied her face, recalling how many burdens she had carried for him since Ned's death, and nodded. Agreed. Let's go. And with that, the three turned away, leaving the night to swallow Vexen's path, uncertain of what he might do come morning or how swiftly he'd vanish into the skies on his monstrous mount. For now, there was enough to worry about with the immediate tasks: forging alliances, managing the men, and orchestrating the bold retrieval of Jon Snow from the very threshold of the Ilm. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of logistics. Robb's chosen commander for the mission north was not a High Lord, but a man of House Mormont, a grizzled warrior named Helman Rude. Not precisely a noble in name, but longtime retainer to Lady Meage Mormont. He was known for quiet competence, measured judgment, and unwavering loyalty to House Stark. Robb trusted him more than most highborn knights. Helman listened to the king's instructions with a steady gaze. Your Grace, I'll do as commanded. 200 swords, well provisioned, and we'll ride with care. But if the Watch stands in our way, do you truly want us to fight them? They might not yield easily. Robb's jaw flexed. I pray it doesn't come to that. If they refuse and you can't negotiate, you may circumvent them. Some ways around the Wall exist, though they're perilous. But you won't kill any Black Brothers unless they kill your men first. We are not conquerors of the Night's Watch. We only need Jon Snow. Try reason first. Remind them that the realm is in greater peril than they know. Helman nodded. Understood, my king. Catelyn stood by, arms folded, expression tight. She seemed uneasy about this entire plan, but she respected Robb enough not to question him publicly again. If Jon's presence could avert a greater tragedy, she wouldn't stand in the way. Still, she couldn't hide her worry that the Watch might see this as a grave insult, a violation of ancient neutrality. The lines between what was right and what was necessary had grown impossibly blurred. By midday of the second day, the 200 men were assembled. A mixture of foot and cavalry, though mostly cavalry for speed. Pack horses carried enough provisions for the journey up the neck and into the wilds near the Wall. A number of these men had never ventured so far north, but they donned heavier cloaks, expecting cold winds. The king in the north himself bid them farewell, gray wind stalking at his side, muzzle twitching with tension. Remember, Robb said, addressing them, Jon Snow is not your enemy. He is my brother. Bring him safe if you must tie him to his saddle, but do him no harm. I expect your return soon. May the gods watch over you. A quiet but fervent cheer went up. Helman Rude saluted. Without further ceremony, the line of riders set off, hooves drumming the earth. Flags emblazoned with the direwolf design snapped in the breeze, though Robb had ordered them to be furled after a few leagues to minimize attention on the road. Still, few travelers would mistake this for anything but a military column. Robb watched them until they disappeared over the gently rolling hills, the golden-green grasses swaying around them. Only once they were gone did he breathe out a tense sigh. If Jon refused to come, this might end badly. But the realm needed clarity. And Robb, for all his loyalty to the vow of the Night's Watch, felt in his bones that Vexen's warnings were not idle fancy. Something in the far north was stirring. That afternoon, Vexen appeared in Robb's tent, unannounced as ever, though by now the guards had learned not to bar his way. He seemed to drift through the camp in near silence, men parting before him, a mixture of awe and fear shading their eyes. When Vexen entered, Robb set aside the map he'd been studying. Catelyn was present as well, engaged in quiet discussion with Roose Bolton about where the Lannisters might regroup. Vexen wasted no time. "Your men have left for the Wall?" "They have," Robb answered. "Good," Vexen said. "Time presses. I've decided to seek Renly Baratheon's camp. If Renly lives, I want to see if he'll join the effort to remove the Lannisters from King's Landing. Should I fail, I'll approach Stannis. Between them, one can claim legitimacy." Bolton, polite but cold, offered a thin smile. "You assume you can sway them so easily? The Baratheon brothers might not welcome the presence of a dragon any more than the Lannisters would." "I'm aware," Vexen replied. "But the difference is Stannis or Renly might see the bigger picture, especially if they learn about the threat in the far north. The Lannisters see only their wealth and dominion." Catelyn brushed a hand over her skirts. "If it's unity you seek, do you mean to persuade either Baratheon brother to share power with the North? Robb is a king in his own right now." Vexen shifted his gaze to Robb. "That depends on whether King Robb desires a truly independent North or an alliance with whichever Baratheon takes the throne. My interest is in forging a broad coalition. If the North insists on independence, that may stand so long as they'll fight beside the rest of Westeros when the darkness comes." Bolton interjected smoothly, "That is precisely the question. The North has lost much in this war, and many men prefer we remain separate. But if the realm needs unity to survive, perhaps there's a middle path." Robb frowned. "So many complexities." "Very well, Vexen. I'll not bar you from seeking Renly or Stannis. If you find them willing to dethrone the Lannisters and unify, come back to me. We'll discuss terms. But I won't kneel to any man for the sake of it. The North's blood is too fresh on the battlefield." Vexen inclined his head. "That's all I ask, that you keep an open mind. If the war devours us all, it won't matter who sits on the Iron Throne." With that, the silver-haired figure turned to depart. Then, at the threshold, he paused. "And do not be alarmed," he said quietly. "I sense Tywin Lannister may attempt a feint in the next weeks. But if he tries to muster another grand host, I'll ensure he's reminded of what happened at Harrenhal." Bolton's mouth quirked. "Then you'll be patrolling the skies?" A faint, humorless smile touched Vexen's lips. "Something like that." And he was gone, leaving a swirl of chill in the air behind him. Catelyn expelled a slow breath, tension draining from her posture. "We walk a knife's edge, Robb. If you trust him too little, we might lose the greatest advantage in dethroning the Lannisters. Trust him too much, we risk a devastation that dwarfs even Harrenhal." Robb nodded, sliding into a chair. "I know, but I see no other path. We can't defeat Joffrey, stave off Tywin, unify the realm, and prepare for the horrors in the North all on our own. Even the might of the North can't do that alone." Bolton, with that soft tone of his, added, "In that, your grace, you are wise. For now, we proceed carefully." Thus, their uneasy alliance continued, each side aware that Vexen carried the literal power of a mythical dragon behind him, and that Robb's moral stance might conflict with Vexen's readiness to burn entire seats of power. War was a labyrinth of shifting loyalties, but this labyrinth had teeth of fire and ice. Meanwhile, the 200 men galloped north along the King's Road for days, then turned west to avoid known trouble spots, weaving through smaller byways. They braved summer rains, muddy tracks, and occasional sightings of brigands. In a village near the neck, they paused only long enough to reshoe horses and take on water. Rumors followed them. Men whispering of a new black dragon that had burned Harrenhal, or that the king in the north had struck a deal with a demon. Helman Rude shrugged off such talk, urging his men to press forward with haste. The quicker they reached the wall, the sooner they could secure Jon Snow. Little by little, the air grew colder, the nights sharper. The camaraderie among the 200 remained strong, though tension hovered. More than a few wondered aloud how they were to forcibly remove a sworn brother of the Watch. Others spat that the crows might fight them. Hellman kept a firm discipline, reminding them of Robb Stark's command. Minimal bloodshed. "We're not here to butcher crows," he repeated. "Only to fetch Lord Eddard's son." They reached the looming silhouette of the wall as dawn broke on a day braced by cold wind. That towering structure of ice took the breath from many, no matter how many times they had seen it. It shimmered faintly in the early sunlight, a barrier that had stood for thousands of years. At its base lay Castle Black, little more than a series of wooden buildings, a crumbling stronghold overshadowed by the immensity of the wall behind it. Scouts rode ahead to find a vantage. They reported that the watch was indeed active, Black brothers posted at the gate and along catwalks. Hellman Rude motioned for half his force to circle wide, discreetly, in case they needed to threaten an encirclement. He took the other 100 straight up to the gates. A pair of Black brothers eyed them warily from behind the portcullis. "This is Castle Black, seat of the Night's Watch," one called out. "State your business or be gone." Hellman spurred his horse forward a few paces, stopping at a respectful distance. "I come under orders of Robb Stark, King in the North, for Jon Snow." Suspicion bloomed in the Watcher's eyes. "Jon Snow is a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. He's not subject to the demands of any king." Hellman's mouth tightened. "We know the vow, but we have come to speak with him and bring him south. Let us in peacefully, or we'll come in unbidden." The Black brother barked a harsh laugh. "We have old records that say no man threatens the Watch. You want in, you abide by our rules. Lord Commander Mormont will decide if you get an audience." Hellman exhaled. "Then fetch him, quickly." The men in black conferred in hushed tones. Then one disappeared inside. Minutes stretched, the horses shuffling impatiently. Hellman glanced around, noticing how the watchers on the wall's walkway seemed to multiply. Arrows were nocked, though not drawn. A standoff loomed. At last, the portcullis cranked upward, and out walked Lord Commander Jeor Mormont himself, an older man with a balding pate, a stern gaze, and the bearing of a once proud warrior. At his side strode several senior brothers, including Ser Alliser Thorne, who wore a perpetual sneer, and Maester Aemon, who walked with careful steps under the weight of many years. "State your purpose," Jeor Mormont said, voice deep and uncompromising. "I recognize the banners of House Stark, but the Watch is neutral in these wars." Hellman bowed in his saddle, showing respect. "Lord Commander, I come with the greatest respect, but under urgent command from King Robb Stark. Jon Snow is needed in the south. Our realm faces dire threats, and your Black brother may hold knowledge vital to preventing catastrophe." Mormont's bushy eyebrows arched. "Jon Snow is the Lord Commander's steward, among other duties. But that does not give you license to remove him from his vow." "Nevertheless, we must," Hellman insisted. "We do not come as enemies, but we cannot leave without him." Alliser Thorne scowled, crossing his arms. "The impudence! The Night's Watch does not yield men to serve in politics. Your king has no authority here." Hellman forced himself to remain calm. "This is bigger than politics. Ask Jon if he'll come willingly. If he won't, we have orders to take him anyway." Jeor Mormont's gaze hardened. "You realize that attacking the Watch is no small matter. The entire realm is in chaos," Hellman finished. "And the king in the north is not attacking the Watch. We only want Jon. If you want to keep your neutrality, let him come freely." Mormont looked ready to refuse outright, but then something in his face shifted. He glanced at Maester Aemon, who gave a subtle tilt of his head. Mormont exhaled, turning back to Hellman. "Very well, let Jon speak for himself. But if he refuses, you will leave here without bloodshed, or you'll answer to me." "Agreed," Hellman said, lifting a hand to wave his men back. They were not going to storm the gate unless absolutely necessary. The watchers parted, and from the courtyard emerged Jon Snow himself, dressed in the black garb of a steward, a long sword at his hip. He looked older than Hellman expected, the boyishness replaced by the beginnings of a man's lines in his face. News of war and the hardships of the north had etched him, made him lean, eyes sharpened by cold wind. He approached with caution, glancing at the mounted men. "Jon Snow," Helman began, "I am Helman Rood, commander of these 200 men. Your brother, Robb Stark, has sent us to bring you south by any means necessary. We'd prefer it if you come willingly." Jon's expression flickered with shock. "Robb wants me to break my vows? We have reason to believe the realm stands in danger, far greater than any typical war," Helman said. "He needs your knowledge, possibly your presence, to unify allies. You are commanded to come." Jon's mouth set in a firm line. "I am a man of the Night's Watch. My vows are for life. I serve at the wall." Alliser Thorne's sneer deepened. "There you have it. He refuses." But Jeor Mormont held up a hand, forestalling Thorne. "Let the boy speak." Jon took in the sight of the armed riders. 200 men could do great harm to Castle Black if the Watch resisted, though perhaps the Black brothers would put up a fierce fight. He bowed his head a moment. "My duty is here, to hold the wall against what lies beyond. That was what your father told me, Helman, when I joined. Ned Stark believed in the Watch." Helman softened his tone. "We do not dispute that, but your brother claims he has learned that a new threat, White Walkers, whites, something beyond imagination, may soon come crashing over the wall. He wants to hear it from you, in the councils of the Southern Lords, to galvanize them. You might be the only voice they'll heed. Otherwise, the South remains fractured." Jon's eyes flickered with recognition. News of whites and White Walkers was not exactly unknown to him. He himself had encountered terrors in the frosted gloom beyond the wall. Lord Commander Mormont knew it too. The entire Watch had been on edge. "I've told them. They don't listen," Jon said bitterly. "What is my being in the South going to change?" "You're Ned Stark's son," Helman replied. "Some will heed that. If you stand before kings and queens, telling them of the threat, it carries weight. You might help unite them. And if you do, you save the entire realm, including the Night's Watch. Isn't that a greater duty than staying here behind thin numbers?" For a moment, Jon looked stricken, his sense of honor warring with the vow he had taken. He remembered how he had once dreamed of heroics, only to learn that the Watch was a thankless duty. Now, men from the South were essentially demanding he abandon that duty, yet it was in the name of a larger cause. Mormont spoke up. "Jon, you are sworn to me until death, but these are strange times. If your going south might bring the Watch reinforcements, help unify the realm, perhaps it is worth it." His face showed reluctance, but also the heavy weight of leadership. "I am old. My voice might not matter to Southern Lords, but they might listen to a young Stark. If that is what it takes to get more men, more steel for the wall, then I give you leave." Alliser Thorne made an outraged noise. "Lord Commander, you cannot condone." "I can and I will," Mormont snapped. "We need help, Thorne. We stand with a fraction of the men we once had, and the wildlings stir. This may be the only way." His hard eyes turned to Jon. "You must decide, boy. Go with them or stay. I won't force you." Jon stared at Mormont, at the Watchers with arrows trained on the horsemen, at Helman and the 200 strong beyond him. Then he thought of his father, the fate of his half-siblings scattered in war, the rumors of dragons, the talk of White Walkers he had encountered. Perhaps it was the memory of that encounter, blue-eyed corpses rising from the dead, that finally drove him. If going south allowed him to warn the entire realm, could that not be considered an extension of his watchful duty? In a voice that trembled only slightly, Jon said, "If you permit it, Lord Commander, I will go. But I do so not as a deserter, but as a man on a mission for the Watch." Mormont nodded, a spark of relief in his gruff features. "Very well. Go speak for us. Bring us men if you can. The real war is here in the north, but if the Southern Lords remain divided, we're all doomed. Return to us with what you can. That is my order." It was as close to an official sanction as any vowbreaker could hope for. Jon bowed. Alliser Thorne sneered but said nothing more. Maester Aemon gave Jon a sad smile, as though wishing him well. The Black brothers parted, letting Helman and a small contingent approach to offer a horse for Jon. He took it with a mixture of apprehension and determination. And so, without bloodshed, the column of 200 turned back south, this time with Jon Snow among them. He wore his knight's watchblacks, sword on hip, expression set. He had told Samwell Tarly and a few other friends a hurried farewell, telling them to keep safe. The next phase of his life and the realms had begun. While Robb Stark's men hurried south with Jon, Vexen flew his dragon, Carnage as it was named, across the breadth of the warring kingdoms to discover whether Renly Baratheon truly lived. He soared above the patchwork farmland of the Reach, scanning for signs of a grand host. It was not difficult to pick up the scent of armies. Campfire smoke rose in columns, cavalry lines snaked along roads, banners snapped in the wind. But the largest gatherings he found belonged not to Renly's men, but to the Tyrells, now allied with the Lannisters, and apparently mobilizing to bolster King's Landing. If that was the case, then indeed, Renly must have perished or been sidelined. The Tyrell Rose had been transplanted firmly into the Lannister fold. Circling overhead, Vexen saw men scramble, pointing skyward, terror streaking their faces. But he had no interest in burning them if they did not draw arms. A few arrows whistled up, clattering harmlessly off Carnage's immense scales. The black beast snarled, but Vexen patted its flank, guiding it away. Wasting fire on a pointless skirmish would only sow chaos. He traveled on, making short stops in out-of-the-way places for rest and water. Carnage, for all its might, was still a living creature that required occasional respite. With each day, Vexen gleaned more intelligence from scattered refugees, terrified farmers, even minor lords who fell to their knees at the sight of the dragon overhead. Bit by bit, he confirmed that Renly Baratheon had indeed been assassinated under mysterious, possibly sorcerous circumstances not far from Bitterbridge, leaving Stannis as the prime Baratheon claimant. The Tyrells had pivoted to the Lannisters to secure Marjorie's place as queen, betrothed to Joffrey. The realm was in flux, with King's Landing now heavily reinforced by Tyrell might. Stannis, according to rumor, was massing a fleet at Dragonstone, perhaps to strike the capital from the sea. That would be Vexen's next target. A visit to the dour fortress perched on crags of black stone. Stannis was known to be stubborn but also lawful to a fault, at least in the eyes of some. If there was a single man who might see reason about dethroning Joffrey for the realm's sake, it could be Stannis. If not, well, Vexen still had the option of letting Carnage's fire do the talking. Back in the Riverlands, Robb Stark had not yet learned of Jon Snow's approach, but he had plenty of other concerns to occupy his days. True to Vexen's hint, Tywin Lannister had begun a stealthy campaign to reassert some presence in the region, though in smaller groups to avoid being a massive target for Dragonfire. Skirmishes broke out across hills and river crossings. The Northmen, for all their skill, found themselves tested by Tywin's cunning. Supplies ran short in certain areas. The violence wore on. One evening, as Robb was finishing a meal of salt beef and stale bread, a scout burst into the pavilion with urgent news. "My king, Tywin's men attacked a foraging party near the crossroads. They scattered them, took some captives. We chased them off, but they're harrying every supply line we have." Robb let out a frustrated breath. "We need a swift response. We'll strike them at dawn with our outriders, hit their camp." Catelyn, seated at the table's edge, looked up. "Will the men be up for another forced march?" "They'll have to be," Robb said grimly. "We can't let Tywin pick us apart. If only we had the advantage of flight," he added wryly, thinking of Vexen. But the Dragonlord was off forging alliances, or so they hoped. At that, a second messenger arrived, this one wide-eyed. He stammered about a giant shape in the sky near the western horizon, black wings blotting out the setting sun. Robb nearly leapt from his seat, heart racing. But the messenger added that it flew away from them, heading south, not toward their camp. Another fleeting sign of the beast. The next day, as Robb prepared for a campaign of ambushes and counter-raids, a horn blast sounded from the perimeter. It signaled the approach of friendly riders. Robb hurried out, gray wind pacing at his side. He soon recognized the banner of House Mormont. Heart-pounding, he advanced to greet them. 200 men, dusty and travel-worn, trotted into the camp. And in their midst, wearing black as dark as the night, rode Jon Snow. The hush that fell among the assembled Northmen was profound. Many recognized Ned Stark's bastard, who had left Winterfell months before. Jon dismounted stiffly, scanning the camp with mingled confusion and relief. Then his eyes locked on Robb. For a moment, both men were transfixed. They had parted as brothers, never dreaming they might see each other amid the chaos of war. "Jon," Robb murmured, stepping forward. He extended his arms. Jon did the same. They embraced, albeit awkwardly, mindful of swords and cloaks. A wave of emotion coursed through them. They were no longer boys sparring in Winterfell's courtyard. War and hardship had changed them. "You came willingly?" Robb asked, voice quiet, but tinged with disbelief. Jon nodded. "Lord Commander Mormont permitted it, for the realm's sake. But I must return eventually. My watch isn't ended." Robb's chest ached, recalling how dearly he had wanted to see Jon free of the vow. "For now, I need you here. Come, we have so much to discuss." He glanced at Helman Rude. "Thank you. You've done well." Helman saluted. "No blood spilled, Your Grace." The watch allowed him to leave. While the men moved to stable their horses, Robb guided Jon into his tent, where Catelyn, along with several key lords, Bolton, Karstark, the Great Jon, had gathered in response to the commotion. Catelyn's lips pressed thin at the sight of Jon, but she said nothing. Ned's final wishes had included providing for Jon. She might never have fully accepted him as a son, yet she would not shame him publicly. Jon bowed his head to her. "My lady, I'm sorry about everything." She inclined her head in an almost civil gesture, though her eyes carried the weight of grief. "You're welcome here, Jon. Your father would have wanted it." Robb ushered him to a seat. "You must be weary, but we can't wait. I have to know, what do you know of these rumors, White Walkers, whites in the far north?" Jon took a measured breath, then recounted the horrors he had seen beyond the wall. Unearthly cold, corpses that rose from the dead with glowing blue eyes. Others in the watch had witnessed them. There were rumors of an army forming deep in the frost. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, was gathering wildlings in enormous numbers, supposedly fleeing from the White Walkers themselves. The tension in the tent mounted as Jon described finding 2 rangers dead and reanimated, attacking his brothers in the night, and the dreadful sense that something far worse lurked in the icy dark. By the time he finished, the lords were silent. Even Great Jon Umber, who had a hearty appetite for tall tales, looked unnerved. Bolton's pale eyes flicked to Robb. "So it is real. We face an enemy that does not rest, does not fear steel. If the Watch's numbers are too few, how do we fight it?" Robb's hands curled into fists at his sides. "That's exactly the question. Vexen seems convinced we need the entire realm's might to push back this threat. Otherwise, we all die." He turned to Jon. "And that is why I had to bring you. It's not that I don't respect your vows. But if the Southern Lords won't believe me, maybe they'll believe you, a man who actually fought these nightmares." Jon's face clouded. "I understand. I only pray they'll listen. King's Landing, the Iron Throne. They've ignored the North for so long. All they care about is their little war." Karstark muttered, "Little war, indeed. Meanwhile, thousands die. If only we had known this. We might have saved so many resources, so many men." Catelyn's voice was subdued. "We still must end the Lannisters' tyranny. The realm can't unify under Joffrey's madness. My Ned died for exposing the truth about him." She paused, regarding Jon's black attire with an odd mixture of sadness and disapproval. "Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't easy for you. Perhaps we can do what's needed." Jon nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his features at her tempered acceptance. Then he looked around, realizing who wasn't in the tent. "Where's Vexen? Robb wrote that he was the one who told you to send for me." "He's off trying to unite the Baratheons," Robb said wryly. "Or so he claims." He also mentioned wanting to dethrone Joffrey by any means. It's complicated. He's the one with the dragon. Jon's eyes widened. I heard rumors at the wall. A black dragon bigger than the stories of Balerion. I thought them tall tales. Not tales, said the great Jon, voice solemn. The Lannisters' battered husks at Harrenhal can prove it. Jon rubbed the back of his neck, absorbing this new reality. Gods, dragons truly returned. Between that and the White Walkers, it feels like a nightmare from the old stories. Robb drew a breath, trying to exude calm leadership. We can't crumble under the weight of it. We must find a way to unify lords. Stannis, the River Lords, maybe even the Tyrells if they can be swayed again. Then we deal with King's Landing. Because if the Lannisters remain in power, the realm stays fractured. Jon nodded. I'll do what I can. I'll tell them what I saw beyond the wall. They need to understand that the old war for thrones pales next to this. If we fail to unite, the dead will claim all. Bolton laced his fingers. So, the question becomes, how soon might Vexen return? And do we wait for him? Or do we press on to force the Lannisters into submission so that the realm might face the threat? The great Jon tossed back a gulp of ale from a horn. I say we take the fight to Tywin, keep pressuring him. If Vexen shows up with his dragon, all the better. Robb pursed his lips. That might be wise. I can't sit idle. Each day I wait gives Tywin time to regroup. We'll strike swiftly. Meanwhile, Jon, you'll remain with me. We'll handle any parley with Southern Lords if the chance arises. You'll speak to them of the White Walkers. Jon exhaled heavily. I never wanted to be a messenger for doomsday, but if that's what I must do, I will. He could almost feel the weight of the entire realm pressing on his shoulders. Memories of nights on the wall, gazing into infinite darkness, returned to him. Would the Southern Lords heed his words, or laugh him out of the hall? He had no illusions it would be easy, but if even one king or queen could be convinced, that might start the chain reaction needed to save countless lives. Far away, on the rocky shores of Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon stood atop his windswept battlements, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea churned, dark and restless, dotted with the war galleys that flew the flaming heart sigil of the Lord of Light. He planned to strike King's Landing soon, to tear down Joffrey's false claim. Yet doubts plagued him, gnawing at his stubborn pride. Melisandre, the Red Priestess, appeared at his side, robes rippling in the gust. My king, I have seen shadows in the flames, a black shape greater than any living beast. Wings spread across the sky. Fire, yet not the fire of R'hllor, something older. Stannis scowled, recalling scattered rumors. A dragon, they say, another Targaryen scion or some Valyrian usurper. And he burned Tywin's forces at Harrenhal. Melisandre's lips curved in a faint smile, a sign of old power stirring. But the true fight remains with you, Stannis. You are Azor Ahai reborn. The flames do not lie. Stannis's mouth tightened. If I have to face a dragon to claim the throne, so be it. We muster for an assault on King's Landing. The Lannisters will not hold it long, not with the new alliance we have forged with. He paused, remembering that half his offers to lords had been overshadowed by fear or greed. No matter. We sail soon. Melisandre tilted her head. What if the Dragon Lord offers you alliance? Would you refuse it out of hand? He turned sharply. That depends on his demands. I won't bow to a pretender or share my rightful throne with some Valyrian conjurer. There are older truths in these lands than your rightful claim, Melisandre said softly. But you must choose your path. The night is dark and full of terrors. Sometimes a greater fire is needed to banish it. Stannis offered no reply, gazing again at the roiling sea. The old walls of Dragonstone moaned under the wind. War's tide was rising, and dragons soared in the sky. The future seemed more precarious than ever. Thus, the pieces edged closer to alignment or misalignment. Jon Snow rejoined his half-brother, determined to warn the southern powers. Robb Stark prepared to confront Tywin anew, hoping Vexen would soon reappear with alliances that might help remove Joffrey without incinerating the capital. Catelyn prayed that her children would survive the storms of war. Lords across Westeros whispered that a monstrous black dragon might come for King's Landing. And Vexen, astride Carnage, sought out Stannis with designs on forging a union or, failing that, forging a path of fire straight to the Red Keep. Somewhere in the swirl of these events, the lines between necessity and cruelty, between vengeance and salvation, blurred. Men spoke of the War of the Five Kings as if it were everything, yet the wise or the frightened might recall that a sixth power loomed, one with black wings and the will to burn entire seats of power if negotiations failed. Deeper still lurked the rumor of walking corpses beyond the wall, an enemy that might dwarf even the might of dragons. For now, though, the day-by-day struggle continued. Robb's 200 returned triumphant, carrying Jon Snow into an uncertain future. The Northmen prepared new offensives against Lannister positions, aiming to hamper Tywin's movements. At night, men huddled by the fires, telling fearful tales of White Walkers and a dragon that was either salvation or doom. And in his tent, Robb confided to Jon more details about Vexen's talk of the Song of Ice and Fire, the cryptic references to prophecy, and the role Jon might play. Jon listened, troubled. "I'm just a bastard," he said quietly. "But if the realm needs me to speak, I will speak. I saw horrors in the night. If the lords dismiss that, no Iron Throne will matter when the others come." And Robb, clasping Jon's shoulder, answered with the seriousness of a king. "Your being a bastard means nothing to me or father. Blood is blood. And if your words can save lives, you'll have my full support." Thus they pressed on, hoping that maybe, between a reluctant alliance with a dragon lord and the battered unity of northern banners, they could dethrone the inbred bastard, as Vexen called him, and his mother without immolating half of King's Landing. And if that unity took shape, they would stand against the gathering cold that threatened all life. If it failed, a tide of darkness might sweep the realm, from the Red Keep's burning ruins to the icy expanses beyond the wall, leaving only ashes and corpses under a pale, unforgiving sky. In the days to come, Vexen would indeed look upon King's Landing from high above, black wings casting a dread shadow on the city's walls. Whether he would show mercy or unleash total devastation depended on the fragile tapestry of alliances he and Robb managed to weave. And even that might pale in comparison to the final confrontation with Winter's unnamed horrors. Only time would reveal whether they had the wisdom to unite and the strength to survive.